The radio crackled with desperate voices as Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey pushed his Douglas Dauntless into a screaming dive toward the Japanese carrier Kaga. Below him, the once perfect formation of Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's mobile striking force had dissolved into chaos. What had begun as Japan's most coordinated naval operation was now fragmenting like glass under a hammer blow. At 09:26 hours on June 4, 1942, the first American bomb struck Akagi's flight deck, and with it died the intricate clockwork precision that had carried Japanese forces to victory. Across half the Pacific, the carrier that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack was now a blazing tomb, her hangar deck erupting in secondary explosions that sent debris spinning through the morning sky. Admiral Nagumo stood frozen on the bridge of his flagship as flames consumed the ship around him. For 6 months, his Kido Butai had operated with mechanical perfection, launching strikes, recovering aircraft, maneuvering information with the synchronized precision of a ballet troupe. Every pilot knew his assignment. Every ship captain understood his role. Every radio operator followed established protocols. That had never failed, but American codebreakers had shattered that perfection by reading Japan's most secret communications. What the Japanese believed was a surprise attack on an unsuspecting enemy base had become a carefully orchestrated ambush. The hunters had become the hunted, and their legendary coordination was unraveling in real time. Captain Jisaku Okada of Akagi shouted orders through the smoke and chaos, but his damage control parties could no longer hear him over the roar of fires and exploding ammunition. The ship's internal communication system had been severed by the first bomb hit, leaving each section to fight for survival in isolation. The vessel that had served as the nerve center for Japanese carrier operations was now a collection of disconnected compartments, each facing its own desperate battle against destruction. 2 miles away, the carrier Kaga suffered an even worse fate. Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best led his dive bomber squadron in a precision attack that demonstrated how thoroughly American pilots had studied Japanese carrier design. 3 direct hits penetrated the flight deck when it was crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, creating a chain reaction of explosions that gutted the ship's interior. The same radio frequencies that had once carried crisp orders and acknowledgments now transmitted only screams and garbled pleas for help. Flight operations, the cornerstone of carrier warfare, ceased entirely as deck crews abandoned their posts to fight fires or simply survive. Aircraft returning from the Midway strike circled helplessly overhead, their fuel running low while their home bases burned beneath them. According to combat action reports filed with the U.S. Naval War College, the destruction of Japanese command and control capabilities occurred within the first 30 minutes of the American attack. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, hero of Pearl Harbor, limped his damaged aircraft back toward the burning fleet to witness the destruction of everything he had helped create. The same tactical formations that had seemed invincible just hours earlier were now scattered across miles of ocean, each ship fighting its own individual battle for survival. What made the collapse particularly devastating was how completely it contradicted Japanese naval doctrine. For decades, the Imperial Navy had trained for coordinated fleet actions where multiple carriers would support each other through integrated air operations. This coordination had been their greatest advantage over American forces still learning the complexities of carrier warfare. But coordination required communication, and communication required functioning command structures. As Akagi's bridge filled with smoke and Kaga's island superstructure erupted in flames, the invisible bonds holding the Japanese formation together snapped like overstressed cables. The transfer of Admiral Nagumo's flag from the burning Akagi to the cruiser Nagara at 10:15 hours marked more than a change of flagship. It symbolized the complete breakdown of Japanese tactical coordination. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the commander of the Kido Butai found himself aboard a vessel that couldn't launch or recover aircraft, effectively severing him from the very forces he was supposed to direct. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto of Soryu experienced this command collapse firsthand when his carrier took 3 direct hits from dive bombers launched by USS Yorktown. Within minutes, his ship's sophisticated combat information center was destroyed, leaving him unable to coordinate with other vessels in his force. The captain who had helped orchestrate the attack on Pearl Harbor now stood isolated on his burning bridge, shouting orders that no one could hear over the roar of uncontrolled fires. The Japanese had built their entire Pacific strategy around the concept of Kessin decisive battle, where their superior training and coordination would overwhelm numerically superior American forces. But Kessin required perfect timing, integrated operations, and seamless communication between all units. At Midway, these prerequisites evaporated in the space of 30 minutes. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, leading the Japanese strike on Midway Atoll, found his carefully planned attack disrupted by radio calls from the burning fleet. Instead of receiving clear orders for his next mission, he heard only fragmentary transmissions filled with damage reports and desperate calls for assistance. The pilot who had helped sink HMS Prince of Wales now struggled to understand what was happening to his own forces. The breakdown cascaded through every level of the Japanese command structure. Squadron leaders couldn't contact their carrier group commanders. Ship captains received contradictory orders from multiple sources. Damage control parties worked without coordination, sometimes fighting the same fires from opposite directions, while leaving other critical areas UNDEFE and DED. On Hiryu, the sole surviving Japanese carrier, Captain Tomio Kaku attempted to maintain some semblance of coordinated operations, but with Akagi burning, Kaga sinking, and Soryu wreathed in flames, his ship was operating in complete isolation. The beautiful geometric formations that had characterized Japanese fleet movements dissolved into individual ships scattered across miles of ocean, each fighting its own private war. Naval intelligence assessments from the National Security Agency archives reveal that Japanese radio discipline completely collapsed. During the first hour of the American attack, the contrast with American operations was striking. Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard USS Enterprise maintained constant communication with his task force commanders throughout the battle. When Yorktown came under attack, he coordinated protective measures while simultaneously directing strike operations against the remaining Japanese carriers. American command structure, though less elegant than the Japanese system, proved far more resilient under combat stress. Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise Air Group, exemplified this resilience when he made the crucial decision to extend his search pattern beyond the planned parameters. Operating under Spruance's mission-type orders rather than rigid Japanese-style directives, he possessed the freedom to adapt to changing circumstances. This flexibility led directly to the discovery of the Japanese fleet and the devastating attacks that followed. The Japanese, by contrast, had trained their commanders to follow detailed, predetermined plans, with little room for improvisation. When those plans encountered unexpected circumstances like the complete surprise achieved by American forces, the system seized up like an engine without oil. Officers trained to execute perfect choreography found themselves helpless when the music suddenly changed. As morning gave way to afternoon, the evidence of command breakdown became overwhelming. Japanese ships maneuvered independently, sometimes interfering with each other's operations. Air cover dissolved as fighter pilots received conflicting orders or no orders at all. Damage control efforts, once coordinated through Central Command, became fragmented local actions that often worked at cross purposes. The great machine that had conquered Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies was revealing its fundamental weakness and inability to adapt. When its perfect coordination was shattered by the chaos of battle, the destruction of Akagi's radio room at 9:47 hours effectively decapitated Japanese fleet communications. Just as the battle reached its most critical phase, Chief Radioman Watanabe died at his post trying to maintain contact with other carriers. His final transmission cut short mid-sentence as flames engulfed the ship's communication center. With him died the intricate web of radio links that had synchronized Japanese operations across the Pacific for 6 months. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay's torpedo squadron from USS Enterprise pressed home their attack on Kaga despite withering defensive fire, their sacrifice serving a purpose beyond their immediate tactical objective by forcing Japanese fighters to concentrate at low altitude. They disrupted the elaborate air traffic control system that normally managed combat air patrols. With clockwork precision, Zero fighters that should have been positioned to intercept incoming dive bombers were instead engaged in shooting down American torpedo planes. The breakdown in air coordination proved particularly devastating when the second wave of American attacks began. Captain Mark Mitcher's air group from USS Hornet had been searching for the Japanese fleet. Using outdated position reports, under normal circumstances, Japanese combat air patrol would have maintained comprehensive coverage at all altitudes, making such an approach suicidal. But with communication systems shattered and fighter direction compromised, gaps appeared in their defensive screen. Commander Maxwell Leslie's dive bomber squadron from Yorktown exploited these gaps with lethal efficiency. His pilots had trained extensively in coordinated attacks, but they had also learned to operate independently when communications failed. A lesson Japanese aviators had never needed to master. As they rolled into their dives on Soryu, they demonstrated how American tactical flexibility could overcome Japanese technical superiority. The collapse was most evident in the frantic radio traffic that filled Japanese frequencies after the first bomb hits. Previously crisp acknowledgments and status reports gave way to overlapping transmissions, desperate calls for help, and contradictory orders from multiple command authorities. Pilots returning from the Midway strike found themselves unable to contact their carriers, circling helplessly as their fuel supplies dwindled. Intercepted Japanese communications, analyzed by the U.S. Navy's Communication Security Section, show complete breakdown of operational coordination, beginning at approximately 0930 hours. Captain Kaku aboard Hiryu struggled to maintain some semblance of command and control, but his efforts only highlighted the magnitude of the collapse. Without direct communication with other carriers, he was forced to rely on visual signals and assumptions about what other units might be doing. The sophisticated information-sharing network that had enabled Japanese victories from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon had been reduced to semaphore flags and speculation. The Americans, meanwhile, demonstrated the resilience of their more decentralized command structure. When Yorktown's communications were damaged during the first Japanese counterattack, her pilots continued coordinating through backup frequencies and established protocols. Admiral Fletcher's tactical decisions were quickly transmitted throughout his task force, maintaining operational cohesion even under intense combat stress. Japanese damage control efforts reflected the same communication breakdown that plagued combat operations. On Akagi, repair parties in the forward sections had no contact with those working aft, leading to duplication of effort and missed priorities. Critical decisions about flooding ballast tanks or abandoning ammunition magazines were made in isolation, without the overall coordination that effective damage control required. The situation aboard Kaga was even worse. Multiple fires burned throughout the ship, but the central damage control station had been destroyed in the initial bombing. Repair parties worked heroically but blindly, often discovering only by accident that their efforts were being duplicated elsewhere while other critical areas went unattended. The carrier that had once epitomized Japanese engineering excellence became a floating example of how quickly coordination could collapse under combat stress. As the afternoon wore on, the communication breakdown became self-perpetuating. Ships that might have provided mutual support operated in isolation, unaware of each other's status or intentions. The geometric precision that had characterized Japanese fleet movements gave way to random maneuvering as individual captains made independent decisions based on incomplete information. What had begun as the most coordinated naval operation in Japanese history was degenerating into a collection of individual battles, fought by isolated units with no common purpose or mutual support. By noon on June 4th, the Japanese Mobile Striking Force had ceased to exist as a coordinated unit, for burning carriers scattered across 20 miles of ocean fought their individual battles against destruction while their escorts maneuvered independently, each captain making desperate decisions without knowledge of what other ships were attempting. The formation that had struck Pearl Harbor with such devastating coordination had dissolved into a collection of isolated vessels struggling for survival. Captain Tomio Kaku aboard Hiryu epitomized this isolation as he prepared his counterattack against the American fleet. Under normal circumstances, his strike would have been coordinated with attacks from other carriers, creating overwhelming pressure on enemy defenses. Instead, he found himself planning a single ship operation using the remnants of his air group while having no idea whether Akagi, Kaga, or Soryu could contribute any aircraft to the effort. The first Japanese counterstrike launched from Hiryu at 10:58 hours demonstrated both the skill of individual crews and the fatal weakness of operating without coordination. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 dive bombers toward USS Yorktown, but his force lacked the overwhelming numbers that had made earlier Japanese attacks so successful. American fighter directors, coordinating through intact communication networks, concentrated their defensive resources against this single threat. USS Yorktown's Combat Information Center tracked the incoming raid with radar precision, vectoring Grumman Wildcat fighters to intercept while coordinating defensive maneuvers with her escort vessels. The American task force operated as a unified system, each ship knowing its role and receiving timely updates about threat development. This stood in stark contrast to the Japanese situation, where individual ships operated blind to each other's actions. The attack on Yorktown succeeded in damaging the American carrier, but at tremendous cost. Of the 18 Japanese dive bombers that began the attack, only 6 returned to Hiryu. The surviving pilots reported engaging what appeared to be the entire American combat air patrol, suggesting that enemy coordination remained intact despite the morning's battles. For Captain Kaku, this intelligence confirmed his worst fears about fighting alone against a coordinated enemy force. Combat action reports from Task Force 16, preserved in Naval Historical Center archives, document the effectiveness of coordinated American defensive operations throughout the engagement. Meanwhile, the death agonies of the 3 burning Japanese carriers continued in isolation. Akagi's crew fought fires for over 8 hours without receiving assistance from other ships, her escorts maintaining distant positions to avoid secondary explosions. The flagship that had coordinated Japanese naval aviation across the Pacific died alone, her final radio transmissions unheard by vessels that might have provided help. Kaga presented an even more tragic picture. Captain Jisaku Okada remained at his post as fires consumed his ship, but his damage control efforts lacked coordination with other vessels that might have provided assistance. Destroyers assigned to rescue survivors operated without central direction, sometimes duplicating efforts while leaving other areas of the ship unattended. The great carrier settled by the bow, as individual heroism proved insufficient to overcome the lack of systematic coordination. The second Japanese strike from Hiryu, launched at 100 hours, consisted of only 10 torpedo bombers under Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga's leadership. This piecemeal attack faced the same coordinated American defenses that had defeated the earlier raid, but now with even fewer aircraft and no possibility of support from other carriers. Tomonaga's pilots pressed home their attack with suicidal courage, scoring the torpedo hits on Yorktown, but the cost was again prohibitive. Captain Elliot Buckmaster's decision to abandon Yorktown demonstrated how American coordination extended even to damage control operations. His crew had fought fires and restored power through systematic damage control procedures. And when the situation became hopeless, the evacuation proceeded with the same organizational efficiency that had characterized American operations throughout the battle. The contrast became even more apparent during Hiryu's final hours, when American dive bombers found the last operational Japanese carrier at 1600 hours. Captain Kaku faced them alone. No other carriers could provide fighter support. No coordinated defensive maneuvers were possible, and no rescue operations had been prearranged. The ship that represented Japan's last hope for victory at Midway died in isolation, her crew's heroic efforts unsupported by the systematic coordination that had once made Japanese naval aviation invincible. As evening approached, the remnants of what had been the most powerful carrier force in the world continued their separate struggles against the sea. Each captain made individual decisions about scuttling, evacuation, and survival without reference to any overall plan or coordination with other units. The machine-like precision that had characterized Japanese operations for 6 months had given way to the chaos of individual desperation. The collapse of Japanese fighter coordination became most apparent at 13:45 hours, when Lieutenant Commander John Smith Thatch's squadron encountered 0 fighters, operating without ground control guidance. The same pilots who had dominated Pacific skies through superior coordination now flew individual combat missions, unable to mass their forces effectively against concentrated American attacks. Thatch's revolutionary Thatch-Weave defensive formation, designed to counter Japanese numerical superiority, proved devastatingly effective against uncoordinated enemy fighters. Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, leading the second attack wave back from Midway, found himself unable to contact his home carriers for landing instructions. The fighter direction officers who normally managed air traffic with split-second precision were either dead, wounded, or cut off from communication with airborne forces. Pilots low on fuel began making independent decisions about where to attempt landings, leading to dangerous crowding at the few remaining operational flight decks. The destruction of Akagi's Air Operations Center at 9:52 hours eliminated the sophisticated fighter direction capability that had made Japanese combat air patrol so effective. Chief Aviation Officer Masuda had coordinated defensive fighter operations across for carriers, tracking incoming threats on plotting boards and vectoring interceptors with mathematical precision. His death in the bombing attack left individual ship captains trying to manage air defense without the comprehensive situational awareness that effective coordination required. Captain Kaku aboard Hiryu attempted to maintain some fighter control capability, but operating without information from other carriers severely limited his effectiveness. His Combat Information Center could track threats approaching his own ship, but had no knowledge of attacks developing against other units. This fragmentation allowed American dive bomber squadrons to achieve local superiority by concentrating against individual targets while Japanese fighters remained scattered across a wide area. The breakdown was most evident during the American attack on Soryu at 10:25 hours. Captain Yanagimoto's ship had 60 fighters on combat air patrol, but they were operating without coordination with fighters from other carriers. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's dive bombers achieved complete surprise because the fragmented Japanese fighter direction system failed to mass defensive resources against the threat. Analysis of Japanese fighter operations, documented in the Strategic Bombing Survey's Pacific Theater reports, reveals complete breakdown of coordinated air defense after the initial American attacks. The contrast with American fighter direction was striking. Lieutenant Commander John Smith Jimmy Flatley aboard Enterprise coordinated defensive operations across multiple carriers, using radar tracking and radio communication to position fighters where they would be most effective. When Japanese attacks developed against Yorktown, he was able to vector additional fighters from Enterprise to supplement the threatened carrier's defenses. American pilots also demonstrated superior adaptability when their own coordination systems came under stress. When Yorktown's Combat Information Center was damaged during the first Japanese counterattack, her pilots continued operating using backup communication channels and pre-established protocols. The decentralized nature of American fighter tactics proved more resilient than the rigid Japanese system that depended entirely on perfect coordination. The death of experienced Japanese fighter leaders compounded the coordination problem. These pilots had trained extensively in complex formation flying and coordinated attack patterns that required constant communication and mutual support. When communication links were severed and formation leaders were killed, the surviving pilots found themselves operating in tactical situations for which they had received little preparation. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced fighter pilots, later described the confusion that gripped Japanese aviation operations after the initial bomb hits. "We had trained to fight as units, supporting each other through radio contact and visual signals. When that coordination was lost, each pilot had to make independent decisions in situations that required group responses. The fragmentation of Japanese fighter operations allowed American bomber crews to press home attacks. That should have been suicidal. When Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led his dive bomber squadron against Kaga, he encountered fierce resistance from individual Zero fighters, but faced no coordinated defensive formation. Japanese pilots fought heroically, but their individual efforts lacked the mutual support that effective air defense required. As the afternoon progressed, the absence of effective fighter direction became a death spiral for Japanese operations. Remaining fighters burned fuel in uncoordinated patrols, unable to concentrate against specific threats. Pilots returning from combat missions found their landing approaches complicated by the lack of centralized traffic control, leading to accidents and delays that further degraded operational effectiveness. The sophisticated system that had made Japanese naval aviation the terror of the Pacific had proven fatally dependent on perfect coordination, and when that coordination was shattered, the geometric precision that had defined Japanese fleet movements since Pearl Harbor dissolved completely at 1400 hours, when Admiral Nagumo ordered individual ships to take independent evasive action. The mathematical formations that had allowed for carriers and their escorts to operate as a single, coordinated unit gave way to desperate maneuvering as each captain fought to save his own vessel from American dive bomber attacks. Destroyer Captain Amagai Takahisa aboard Isakaze watched in horror as the carefully maintained intervals between capital ships collapsed into chaos. His vessel, trained to maintain exact position relative to the carrier Kaga, now found itself dodging not only American bombs, but also the unpredictable movements of friendly ships, whose captains had abandoned formation discipline in favor of survival. The breakdown was most apparent during the final attack on Hiryu at 1600 hours. Captain Kaku's ship attempted to maneuver radically to avoid the screaming dive bombers from Enterprise, but her escorting destroyers were no longer maintaining coordinated defensive positions. Each vessel turned independently, creating gaps in the anti-aircraft screen that American pilots exploited with devastating effectiveness. Lieutenant Commander Richard Halsey Best, leading the attack on Hiryu, noted how completely Japanese tactical discipline had collapsed. 6 hours earlier, they had been maneuvering in perfect formation. He later reported, now each ship was fighting its own private war, with no apparent coordination or mutual support. The contrast with American operations remained stark throughout the engagement. Admiral Raymond Spruance's task force maintained formation integrity, even under intense Japanese counterattacks, allowing concentrated anti-aircraft fire and coordinated fighter direction. When USS Yorktown came under attack, her escorts moved smoothly into predetermined defensive positions while maintaining communication and mutual support. Fleet tactical publications recovered from Japanese sources after the war reveal the rigid nature of their formation doctrine and its vulnerability to disruption. The destruction of formation discipline had cascading effects throughout Japanese operations. Supply ships that had maintained precise positions to provide fuel and ammunition found themselves scattered across miles of ocean, unable to support the combatant vessels that desperately needed their services. The geometric beauty of Japanese fleet movements, once compared to a ballet performed on the ocean stage, had devolved into individual ships running for their lives. Captain Abe Hiroaki aboard the cruiser Tone exemplified this breakdown as he attempted to rescue survivors from the burning carriers. Under normal circumstances, such operations would have been coordinated through Fleet Command, with specific ships assigned to rescue duties while others maintained combat positions. Instead, individual captains made their own decisions about when and where to attempt rescues, leading to duplication of effort and missed opportunities. The collapse was particularly evident in anti-aircraft operations. Japanese doctrine called for interlocking fields of fire from multiple ships, creating defensive zones that attacking aircraft would have to penetrate. But with formations shattered and ships maneuvering independently, these defensive zones ceased to exist. American dive bombers found themselves attacking individual targets protected only by their own Anti-aircraft guns. Damage control efforts aboard the burning carriers also suffered from the loss of formation. Discipline. Ships that might have provided assistance remained at distant intervals to avoid secondary explosions, but without coordinated planning, this caution became abandonment. The precise positioning that had once allowed mutual support between vessels now worked against Japanese survival efforts. The psychological impact of formation breakdown proved almost as devastating as its tactical consequences. Japanese officers had been trained to think in terms of coordinated fleet actions, where individual ships derived strength from their integration into larger formations. When that integration was destroyed, many captains found themselves psychologically as well as tactically isolated. As evening approached, the remnants of what had been the most disciplined naval force in the world continued their individual struggles. Without coordination or mutual support, destroyers picked up survivors according to the personal decisions of their captains, rather than any systematic plan. Cruisers provided fire support based on local situations rather than fleet-wide coordination. The Great Formation that had struck Pearl Harbor with such devastating effect had dissolved into scattered groups of ships, each fighting its own battle, against an enemy that maintained the coordination the Japanese had lost. The machine-like precision that had been their greatest strength had become their fatal weakness. When subjected to the chaos of battle. As the sun set on June 4, 1942, the Pacific Ocean bore silent witness to the complete dissolution of what had been the most coordinated naval force in history. For Japanese aircraft carriers lay on the ocean floor, carrying with them not only 3,000 lives, but the entire concept of precision naval warfare that had dominated Japanese strategic thinking since the Russo-Japanese War. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, receiving fragmentary reports aboard his flagship Yamato, gradually comprehended the magnitude of the disaster. The architect of Pearl Harbor had gambled everything on decisive battle, believing that superior Japanese coordination could overcome American industrial advantages. Instead, he watched his perfectly orchestrated machine destroy itself when its coordination was shattered by enemy action and the chaos of combat. The final irony came at 1800 hours when Captain Kaku chose to scuttle Hiryu, rather than allow her capture. The last operational carrier of the mobile striking force died not from enemy action, but from Japanese torpedoes, fired by destroyer Makagumo on orders from an admiral who could no longer coordinate rescue operations. The ship that had represented Japan's final hope for victory at Midway took her secrets of coordination to the Pacific depths. Captain Elliot Buckmaster's decision to abandon USS Yorktown demonstrated how American coordination extended even to defeat. His crew evacuated in good order, with predetermined assignments and systematic damage assessment. When the carrier finally sank 3 days later, struck by Japanese submarine I-168, she took with her the knowledge that American naval organization had proven superior to Japanese precision. The contrast between the two approaches to naval warfare had been tested in the crucible of combat and found decisively unequal. Japanese coordination, beautiful in its perfection, proved brittle when subjected to unexpected stress. American organization, less elegant but more adaptable, bent without breaking under the pressures of battle. Post-war interrogation of surviving Japanese officers, documented in the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, confirmed that communication breakdown was the primary factor in Japanese defeat at Midway. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, whose navigation skills had led American dive bombers to their targets, later reflected on the battle's decisive moment. When we found them, they were still in perfect formation, he wrote. By the time we finished our attack, they were scattered like leaves in a hurricane. Coordination was their strength, and it became their weakness when we broke it. The human cost of coordination's collapse was measured not just in ships sunk and lives lost, but in the systematic destruction of Japanese naval aviation expertise. The pilots who had perfected coordinated carrier operations lay dead in the Pacific depths, along with the mechanics, radiomen, and deck crews who had made their precision possible. Replacing the ships would take years. Replacing the human coordination would prove impossible. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reviewing battle reports at Pacific Fleet Headquarters, recognized immediately that Midway represented more than tactical victory. The Japanese had revealed a fundamental weakness in their approach to naval warfare, an overdependence on perfect coordination that made them vulnerable to disruption. American industry would exploit this weakness by producing carriers, and aircraft faster than Japan could train crews to operate them with their traditional precision. The strategic implications rippled outward from Midway's coral beaches across the entire Pacific. Theater. Japanese expansion ground to a halt as resources were diverted to replacing the lost coordination. The planned invasion of Australia was cancelled, operations in the Solomon Islands were curtailed, and the initiative passed permanently to American forces who had learned to fight effectively even when their own coordination was imperfect. For the families of the men who died at Midway, both American and Japanese, the lessons of coordination meant little compared to personal loss. But for military historians studying the battle's implications, June 4, 1942, marked a day when mechanical perfection proved less valuable than adaptive resilience, when beautiful coordination died in the flames of practical necessity. The Japanese had created a perfect machine for naval warfare, and it had served them brilliantly until the day it encountered chaos at Midway. In the space of 30 minutes, 6 months of victories were erased, and 3 years of defeats began, all because coordination, their greatest strength, had proven to be their most fatal weakness. When the trap sealed tight around them,